Lately, the federal government has been revving up its tax revenue mobilization in a bid to broaden the tax net and boost revenue into its coffers. One of the latest strategies is the reinforcement of the rules and regulations guiding the implementation of stamp duty across the various sectors of the economy and the ongoing execution of the road infrastructure development and refurbishment investment tax credit scheme in line with Executive Order 7. But how well can the government achieve its tax revenue mobilization and strengthen compliance among Nigerians? But this and more will be the conversation today on the program as an Associate Director of Anderson Tax Nigeria, Michael Ango, joins us now. Good morning, Mr. Ango. Thanks for joining us on the program. But Nigeria's tax to GDP ratio has been 6% for some time now. But considering the 10.4% increase in collection rate to 1.11 trillion naira, which we saw in the first quarter of the year, can we say there's been some improvement?
Oh, yes, definitely. Good morning. I think the first thing you have to do when you are assessing tax collection is to ask yourself, in terms of what is available, what is the quantum of what is being collected? One of the challenges that we've had in Nigeria over time, which is the reason for our comparatively low tax to GDP ratio, is that we've not adequately taxed, the large population and, of course, the GDP that we have. At the time, we had a GDP of close to 500 billion United States dollars. And so in relation to that, there was this perception that our tax collections were not reflective of the potential within the Nigerian economy. Yes, we've had the increment of VAT from 5 to 7.5% in the last 6 months. We've also had FIRS, the federal government, ramping up, as you say, its tax collection efforts with the focus on stamp duty and all of that. So yes, there has been some improvement, but until we have the full picture, I think let's allow for the whole year to happen, and then we'll know whether our tax to GDP ratio has improved. But certainly, I think even for the conversations that are going on, you can feel that there's a renewed buzz concerning tax collection. What is important, of course, is to do it in a very focused manner and in a way that you ensure that you don't overburden people, but then again, everyone pays his or her fair share of taxes for the development of the Nigerian economy.
Now, the government has just reintroduced a full-fledged implementation of the stamp duty and reenacted some seemingly extinct parts of the act, like the 6% stamp duty on personal and official rents. What do tax administrators like you make of this development?
Okay, I think, honestly, for me, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what is the place of the Stamp Duty Act, as it were, in tax administration in Nigeria? And I'm saying that given the provenance of the act. It's a very old act. And if you look at the historical basis for which stamp duty was imposed in Nigeria, it was essentially introduced by the British while they were here because there needed to be some authenticity given to certain documents and certain transactions. So while the stamp duty, has its usefulness and its purposes, I think the current Stamp Duty Act that we have in Nigeria is not one that I think can really achieve what we wanted to achieve. And I say this with all due respect to the efforts that the FIRS is currently making with respect to administering the act. They've done some good work. There were some amendments in the Finance Act 2019, cosmetic amendments, if you ask me, because they do not go far enough. So what I will say is that, yes, it's a law, it exists, it's in our books, we need to implement it now. But for me, where I would like to see FIRS again put some efforts is actually in doing a wholesale amendment of the Stamp Duty Act in order to make it an act that can be implemented in 21st century Nigeria. Yes, there have been some amendments, particularly with respect to electronic stamping of documents, payment of stamp duty on electronic transactions, of course, clarity on the taxing powers between the federal and state governments, as it were. But I don't feel that the amendments that were made in the Finance Act 2019 go far enough. But having said that, it is an existing law in Nigeria. It has to be implemented. And I can say that I commend FIRS for bringing stamp duty back into, national consciousness. Everyone is talking about stamp duty. The next step then is to say, how do you implement this act in a manner that everyone understands, the layman on the street understands what stamp duty For the large corporates, it's always been there. I think there's been some level of compliance. But for, I think, you and I, the individuals, there needs to be more enlightenment. People need to understand what the essence of the act is. And then, of course,
all right, we'll get back to the conversation with Mike Angle in just a moment, but let's just remind you of the latest developments in the crude oil market. Of course, we saw prices down this morning, and that was caused by oversupply concerns as OPEC and its allies wind back production cuts in August. And we've seen a rise in worldwide COVID-19 cases, which is actually pointing to a slower pickup in fuel demand. Brent crude slipped 0.6% to $43.26 a barrel, and U.S. crude futures were also down 0.7% at $39.99 a barrel earlier. Analysts say that investors are actually worried about oversupply as OPEC Plus is due to start reducing production cuts this month, and a recovery in oil prices from record lows is likely to encourage U.S. shale producers to ramp up output. Meantime, oil output by OPEC rose by over 1 million barrels a day in July. That came as Saudi Arabia and other Gulf members extended their voluntary extra supply curbs on top of an OPEC-led deal. All right, let's get back to the conversation with Michael Angle, the Associate Director of Anderson Tax Nigeria. All right, now let's continue the conversation. Now, of course, now that Nigerians will be seeing more emphasis on taxation from the federal government, how well can the government stimulate collaboration with taxpayers to boost their tax morale for improved revenue?
I think the simple thing is that let the input reflect the output. What the average Nigerian wants to see is that when we pay taxes, we want to see that our taxes are being used for the common good. If you go to the countries that have a very high tax compliance rate, the Nordic countries, you go to Norway, you go to Sweden, etc., you'll see that social services there are easily available. People can tap into government services and all of that. So people have a sense of ownership. People believe that if you pay taxes, then you can benefit from your taxes. You can easily access healthcare, you can access social welfare, housing, and all of that. So I think that is one area where government needs to do its own bit. Having said that, that does not excuse, of course, the low compliance rate amongst the Nigerian populace. There are many reasons for that. Some have said the long years of military rule have eroded this feeling of patriotism and nationalism and all of that. But again, the reality is that people respond to what they see. So if you have very good roads to your house, if you have efficient rail services, if you can access healthcare at very moderate cost, subsidized or not by the federal government, it is likely that when it's time to pay your taxes, you will not feel as if you're being shortchanged. But where the average Nigerian pays taxes and doesn't feel that he or she is getting anything back from government, then it also, it affects your ability to pay. Of course, we mustn't always blame the federal government. The state governments also have a role to play in this. Most Nigerians, all Nigerians live in a state, other than those who live in the FCT. So the state governments also have their own role to play. The general perception is that only persons who are in employment, for example, pay personal income taxes, and then only the big corporates are taxed and all of that. So there's a feeling that there isn't, equality in that sense, like everyone is not contributing into the common purse. So there's a lot of work to be done. Again, I must say that I commend this current government for its focus on taxation in the last 4 or 5 years, as we've seen, but more work needs to be done. People need to feel the impact of governance right into their homes. And I'm sure that if years, we'll see that, Nigerians will comply and will have much higher compliance rates than we currently do.
All right, still talking about tax compliance now, of course. In the process of wanting to achieve informal sector taxes, what can be done to avoid overburdening the average trader or shop owners with a multiplicity of taxes from local government to the state and the federal levels?
Yes, very, very good. And this is an issue that has been a life issue. I used to work at the FIRS, and these are issues that we try to tackle while we're there. The issue of multiplicity of taxes, again, is something that is spread across the entire country. But it's a function of two things. One, it's a function of lack of knowledge about the tax laws and what the obligations under the tax laws. And then, of course, the second is the political will to ensure that tax laws are applied as they should be. So what you have essentially is that our tax laws have a range of taxes that should be collected by different levels of government. The federal government has its taxing powers, the state governments and the local governments have their taxing powers. But then what you find out is that one or two levels of government then decide to go outside what their taxing powers are and begin to tax transactions, incomes that should ordinarily not be taxed by them. So I can use an example for interstate travel in Nigeria. You find that if you're traveling from point A to B in Nigeria, probably a commercial vehicle or you're transporting goods, you'll find that at each stage, depending on where you're traveling to, you will get taxed. And these taxes are not official. They might give you a receipt, but nobody knows where these taxes are going to. So I think what has to happen first, let us have some clarity with respect to who can tax what and how those taxes should be paid. My preference, and I think the preference of anyone who is involved in tax administration, is that all tax payments should be done through financial institutions. They should be done electronically. The idea of people paying taxes in cash in the 21st century really shouldn't be happening. I know that a lot of effort, again, has been put in place in creating multiple payment platforms so that you and I can pay your taxes in the comfort of your homes. But the reality is that is only one thing. The next thing then is that if people decide to go outside the remit of the laws, then those people should be punished. People just wake up in the morning and put some logs of wood on the road and then stop vehicles and ask them to pay taxes. These things happen in broad daylight in Nigeria. So a lot needs to be done. I know that the JTB, the Joint Tax Board, has issued several notices. They've said people should stop collecting taxes. The laws also prohibit putting up checkpoints to collect taxes. But it goes even deeper than that. So you find that businesses are generally subject to all sorts of levies, whether in the states or in the local governments, and it's a very big disincentive to business. So you find out people have to pay all sorts of sewage fees, environmental fees, and it really becomes, it gets to a stage when businesses then begin to ask themselves whether they need to operate within a particular environment or not. So I think we must change our mindset and our attitude towards taxation. And I'm talking exactly specifically to the government now. Those businesses are there for a purpose. They're there to boost the economy. If you tax them to death, they will disappear. So one other thing that needs to be done, again, is for communities where businesses are also cited to understand that if you take out all the revenue that businesses make in form of levies and taxes, then there will be absolutely nothing to plow back into the communities. Again, like I said, some of these problems are not problems that will be solved by the stroke of a pen, but it will entail there will need to be engagement at all levels. Maybe the federal government should continue to take the lead in terms of talking to the state governments and the local governments in terms of how to curb this issue of multiple taxation. And we must also realize that these are some of the indices that are taken into consideration when, for example, Nigeria is being ranked on the ease of doing business and ease of paying taxes. So it's something that is not just local or internal, it's also something that has some international consequence for us in terms of how we're perceived in the international community.
We would like to thank you, Associate Director of Anderson Tax Nigeria, Michael Angle, for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Thank you very much.
Nigeria's electricity roadmap will be our focus when we return in just a moment. Please stay with us.